James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." And he said to them, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism that I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Really? That's like when the kids come to the parents and say, "Okay, Dad, we're going to ask you a question, but here's the only thing. Before you know what it is, you have to say yes. Okay?" And of course the dad says, "Oh, I have been hoping you would give me some sort of ultimatum like this, because that's how this whole you not being in charge thing works." Okay, good. So can we stay up all night drinking Dr. Pepper and watching R-rated movies? So this request is comical, right? But not just because of the absurdity of James and John's original question. It's even funnier than that when you consider the whole context of the second half of Mark's gospel. Because this is actually the third time that Jesus has been over this with the disciples. In chapters 8, 9, and 10, Jesus describes to them what it means to be the Messiah, that he must suffer and he must die. The first time is in chapter 8, when Peter rebukes him afterwards, and Jesus tells Peter to "Get behind me, Satan." We remember that. And Jesus responds by rebuking Peter and explaining that whoever wants to save their life must lose it. The second time comes one chapter later, in chapter 9, after Jesus predicts his betrayal and death, and the disciples respond by getting into an argument over, get this, which one of them is the greatest. And Jesus then explains that whoever wants to be first must be last. And so now, chapter 10 is the third time. In verses 32 through 34, immediately prior to our passage, Jesus has again predicted his suffering and death, which prompts this absurd request from the brothers James and John about being his right and left hand men, so to speak. I mean, in none of Jesus's predictions does he explicitly say, "I'm going to be crucified in between a thief on my right hand and another thief on my left hand." But by the third time, James and John have kind of lost all benefit of the doubt. as Jesus tries to explain that whoever wants to become great among them must be the servant of all. It's got to feel a little bit like an exercise in futility at this point. So yes, it's supposed to be tragically funny. How dense and selfish can the disciples be? I might not be the best listener or the smartest theologian or the humblest servant leader, but at least I'm not as clueless and self-absorbed as James and John, right? In Matthew's version of this story, it is actually James and John's mother who makes this request of Jesus. Many Bible scholars hypothesize that Matthew changed Mark's version because he couldn't bear to make the disciples themselves look that bad. And besides, it sort of sounds like a request a mother would make, doesn't it? But anyone who has doubts about how truly difficult it is to adopt the mindset of a servant, to serve others, to let others be first so that you can be last, just needs to spend some time raising a toddler. Well, either that or pay closer attention to current politics. To be honest, I'm really not sure as a father why somehow I assumed that learning how to take turns and share would be easier than it really is. I guess it's because for some of us, at least, it's easier to see other children doing it than to see our own children doing it. Yesterday, Kathy and I took our 2-year-old son, Owen, to a fall festival for his preschool. They had snacks and face painting and raffles and arts and crafts and games and bounce houses. Bounce houses are just about Owen's favorite thing ever. They're about any preschooler's favorite thing ever. And heck, if you could guarantee no injuries or soreness as a result of being in them, I guarantee that they would be just about each of our favorite things ever too. So of course, there's a line to the bounce house yesterday because it's so popular, a line with perhaps a dozen other toddlers and preschoolers waiting patiently in it. A line which Owen proceeds to ignore completely and walk right to the entrance and try to crawl his way in. And of course, we grab him, pull him, kicking and screaming to the back of the line, soothe him, calm him down, explain to him to wait our turn. And he immediately proceeded to do the exact same thing again. And so then we grab him, take him to the back, console him, explain, yada, 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 and he does the same thing again. 3 times. To make a long story short, he never did get to go into the bounce house yesterday. I guess what frustrates me is that sometimes he gets it. Some days he understands. He waits, he helps, he shares, he gives. And he appears to derive such joy from it, such joy from actually sharing a piece of his cookie with a friend or with a parent. So I guess I just feel like the lesson should stick then. Just like learning his ABCs and his numbers. Once he gets those down, he should be able to move on to spelling and reading, addition and subtraction, or in this case, peer mediation, restorative justice seminars, brokering peace between Israelis and Palestinians. It's almost like us. Like we have good days and we have bad days. But before we get too hard on ourselves, or before we get too hard on Jesus' disciples, I invite you to consider what happens in chapter 14 of Mark's Gospel. By then, Jesus has made his 3 predictions of his suffering and death. He knows more than anyone that the Messiah has come to suffer and die. And yet, after he has shared that Passover meal with his disciples and instituted the Lord's Supper, he goes into the Garden of Gethsemane and prays. He knows what he has come to do. He has taught it over and over again. He goes and prays. He doesn't begin his prayer by saying, "Dad, I need you to do whatever I ask of you." No, he says, "Father, I know with you all things are possible," which, when you think about it, is kind of the same thing. And then, despite everything he knows and has taught and has prepared for, despite his best days, he says, "Father, I want you to remove this cup from me." Remove this cup, the cup of his suffering and death. Remove this cup he knows he must drink. This cup he has been assuring everyone he will drink. This cup that he promised James and John that they would drink as well. Now he seems to be saying, "You know what? James and John and Peter and the other disciples' ideas about what it means to be a Messiah don't seem that off base after all. Father, why don't you just go ahead and give me a throne of power and glory so I can put James on my right and John on my left?" And then, yes, of course, he does say, "Not my will, but your will be done." I think if Jesus needed those reminders, we must too. The point of this sermon, measuring greatness, what servant leadership is, if you've been coming to church for a little while, it's not anything you haven't heard before. But sometimes we can wait in that line, and sometimes we just can't help ourselves but crawl over people to get into that bounce house. I hope you will use this morning as a reminder to examine yourselves, to receive God's grace, to know that Jesus needed reminders even, that it is okay. Today is the Children's Sabbath. The Children's Sabbath can be about learning lessons from toddlers. It is also about advocating for justice and fairness on behalf of children who are facing injustice and poverty. And so after the 11 o'clock service, there will be sample letters that you can write to congressional representatives about different issues which will be in the narthex. Issues of changes in the definition of public charges for immigrants who are applying for permanent legal status, and how this proposed rule change might force more people to go without and might force more people into the shadows. and letters you can write about the policies, proposed and actual, of separating children from parents at the border. These are important issues. These are also, no doubt, issues on which we may have disagreement within our congregation. So I encourage you to write a letter, but in the spirit of servant leadership, in addition to that letter, I encourage you to think about writing a letter to someone with whom you disagree. Someone who you can't help but see as that toddler pushing to the front of the line. And see them as they might be on their best day. And give them encouragement and give them grace. For that is how we measure true greatness. Amen.